Young and the Restless Spoilers reveal that Michael entered the holiday season with a weight in his chest he couldn't quite name. As if every glittering light in Genoa City only sharpened the shadows inside him. On the surface, he remained Victor's formidable attorney man who always knew where to stand when power shifted and pressure rose, but beneath that polished control, he felt stretched out between two opposing forces. One was loyalty, built over years of favors, rescues, and the kind of security only Victor Newman could provide. The other was something Michael had once sworn he would never trade away, the belief that justice could not be reduced to a commodity, and that the people he loved should never become collateral damage for anyone's ambition, no matter how untouchable that person seemed. That is why, as the truth about a stolen AI program began to take shape and innovation turned into a weapon aimed directly at Jabot, Michael could no longer avoid the most devastating question of his life. Was he serving a man, or was he enabling a wrongdoing that would poison an entire city? The temptation Michael faced wasn't the usual lure of money or influence. It was the far more corrosive temptation to betray the very principles he took pride in carrying. He understood the comfort of staying silent. He would remain by Victor's side, keep his footing in the orbit of Newman Enterprises, continue living within the protective shield that Victor's power created. But the price of silence was no ordinary dirty deal. This was something more insidious, more sophisticated, because it disguised itself as strategy and progress while quietly legitimizing destruction. In Victor's hands, the stolen AI was no longer a competitive tool. It was a declaration that law and ethics were inconveniences for lesser people. What suffocated Michael most wasn't simply that Victor was attacking Jabot, but the method, taking something that wasn't his, turning theft into dominance, and then expecting everyone around him to endorse it as if it were inevitable. Inside that tightening vice of doubt, Lauren became the only place where Michael could allow the cracks to show. She didn't need him to confess, because she had known him long enough to read the smallest changes, the heavier breath, the distracted stare, the silence that lingered too long after meetings with Victor. Lauren recognized what Michael was trying to bear, not just fear of Victor, but fear of himself. He was terrified that one day he would look back and realize he had defended the wrong thing simply because he had grown accustomed to standing beside the strongest man in the room. Lauren understood that Michael's loyalty was not cheap, but she also understood how cruel this test truly was. Loyalty to one person might now require betrayal of justice itself. And that awareness exhausted Michael, because no matter how disciplined his mind was, his heart still measured life through bonds, through love, through the quiet hope that he was more than a legal instrument. It was in that vulnerable space that Diane stepped in like winter air slipping under a door already rattling with storm. Diane didn't batter Michael with brute force or dramatic ultimatums. She approached him with timing and precision, as if she had waited for the exact moment his defenses were thinnest to offer him a way out. She urged him to help, and what she asked for wasn't merely action, it was a reminder of who Michael had once wanted to be. Diane painted the consequences in sharp, undeniable strokes. If Michael did nothing, Victor would keep using the stolen AI to strike at Jabot, and the fallout would extend far beyond corporate warfare. It would tear lives apart, warp the law, rot the city's faith in fairness. Diane didn't need to speak in grand speeches. She only needed to set the truth on the table and look at Michael as though she knew he could not turn away. Yet because Diane's argument was so perfectly formed, so undeniably right, Michael became even more wary. He questioned whether this was truly a call to the common good or a psychological trap designed to pull him into the Abbott family's war. He knew Diane had her own agenda. She wanted to protect Abbott interests, push Victor into weakness, and turn the scandal into a decisive blow. In her story, Michael wasn't a hero. He was the key that unlocked the door. That suspicion hurt because Michael despised being used. He despised even more the realization that, regardless of Diane's motive, truth remained truth. And once a truth large enough was laid in front of him, he could no longer hide behind doubt as a substitute for courage. The days that followed became a long chain of brutal internal battles. Michael sat alone in his office, staring at details, traces, and documents whose meaning he could not unsee. Each page felt like another cut into the fragile calm he had been forcing himself to maintain. He thought about Victor, about the certainty in Victor's eyes, about the way Victor refused to accept challenge, about the dangerous elegance with which Victor took control of a room. Michael also thought about the people he loved and respected, about friends and colleagues, and the pure feeling of rightness he had once carried when he chose the law. He asked himself whether he was overreacting out of emotion, whether he was turning a harsh but familiar Newman tactic into something bigger than it was. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became. What terrified him most was not losing Victor's favor. It was losing his own self-respect. Michael understood that once he crossed this line, there would be no return. Betraying Victor wasn't like switching sides in an argument. It was striking a match in the center of an empire. It could permanently destroy the relationship between Michael and Victor, twisting every memory, every moment of support, into something contaminated by the single word that Victor could never forgive: a betrayal. Victor wouldn't simply be angry. He would feel humiliated, and when Victor felt humiliated, he punished with the full weight of his power. Michael knew the cost could spill over onto Lauren, onto the life they had built together. Each time he imagined that fallout, his heart tightened with consequence. Lauren stood on the other side of Michael's fear, holding a question she didn't need to voice. Could he survive what this choice would do to him? She knew Michael wanted to be a good man, but she also knew Victor's world did not reward goodness when it made Victor look weak. She didn't pressure him, didn't pull him toward any side, because she understood that the more she pushed, the more Michael would fracture under his own guilt. Instead, she became a mirror, reflecting Michael back to himself. Looking at Lauren, Michael saw what he was truly protecting, not only his bond with Victor, but the future he wanted with the woman he loved. And with that clarity came an even more vicious dilemma: protect the people he loved by staying silent, or risk everything by stopping a wrong that might destroy them all anyway. In the end, Michael's decision didn't arrive as a dramatic explosion. It came as a sudden collapse of every excuse he had been clinging to. He realized that allowing the AI program to continue operating as a weapon was the same as agreeing to watch justice erode day by day. He also realized that once he knew, he no longer had the right to pretend he didn't. And in that moment, he chose what hurt most. He chose justice and his friends over loyalty to Victor. Not because he hated Victor, but because he feared what Victor was becoming. Michael stepped into that choice like stepping into a hurricane, fully aware it would tear everything apart, but equally aware that doing nothing would tear him apart first. He began to cooperate with Diane in secret. This secrecy wasn't glamorous espionage. It was living inside constant tension, measuring every move, every shared detail, every verified document. Michael needed evidence that could not be denied, because a blow against Victor that wasn't strong enough would only ensure Michael's destruction. What he provided gradually formed an unbreakable chain. Victor had used a stolen AI program to attack Jabot. It was no longer suspicion. It was an accusation with teeth sharp enough to shred the credibility of Newman Enterprises itself. What Michael did not expect, or perhaps what he expected but still desperately hoped to avoid, was that the information would leak to the public. Once the secret slipped beyond closed doors, it became wildfire. The scandal erupted like a cyclone, pulling Newman Enterprises into the eye of the storm and forcing Victor onto the defensive. What had been buried under power was now dragged into the light. The public didn't care about internal justifications or strategic necessity. They saw only an empire using stolen AI to destroy a rival. In a world already uneasy about technology and unchecked authority, it was a stain that did not wash away easily. When the news spread, Michael felt no triumph. He felt a hollow, icy emptiness, as if the right part of him had finally spoken, but the human part of him was standing at the funeral of his old life. He knew Victor would find out. He knew the fury was coming, and it would not focus solely on Diane or the Abbotts. It would hunt the source. Michael became a man living between two heartbeats, one of relief that he had not allowed the wrong to continue, and one of dread that he had just struck the one thing Victor guarded most fiercely control. Diane might see this as a necessary turning point. Lauren might feel pride braided tightly with fear. But Michael stood in the middle of it, all carrying the deepest wound. He still questioned whether Diane had manipulated him, but that question no longer mattered the way it once had. Because the event had already occurred and the consequences had already opened their doors. The only thing Michael could hold on to now was the belief that he had done what needed to be done, even if what needed to be done was also the cruelest thing he could do to himself. And in the chaos that followed, the final question remained hanging like a verdict. Had Michael saved justice, or had he ignited a war that would devour the very people he was trying to protect? He knew the answer would not come quickly. But he also knew that from this moment on, he would never again be allowed to live the way he had before. Because when someone decides they will not let a weaponized AI destroy the people they love, they must also accept that the wrath of the powerful may become the first thing that tries to destroy them. Michael had always known there were consequences to working in Victor's orbit, but he had never felt them tighten around his throat quite like this. The pressure didn't come as a single threat or a sudden explosion. It arrived in peace conditions attached to favors, expectations disguised as trust, and subtle psychological leverage that Diane knew how to apply with unnerving precision. Every time Diane pressed him, every time she framed the situation as if the right choice were obvious, Michael felt the ground shifting under him. He understood that Victor Newman was not a game, not a powerful man you could challenge lightly and then walk away from with your life intact. Victor didn't simply retaliate. He erased. He rewrote people's reputations, their futures, their sense of safety. That awareness sat inside Michael like a heavy stone, and yet it didn't silence him. If anything, it made his hesitation more painful, because it meant he was calculating danger while his conscience was begging him to stop calculating and start acting. The real torment was that Michael's loyalty to Victor had once felt like a form of identity. It wasn't only professional allegiance. It was years of being seen, being used, being protected, and sometimes even being valued by a man who rarely valued anyone without turning them into an instrument. Michael had built a life around knowing Victor's rules, anticipating his anger, and translating his ruthlessness into legal language that could survive the light of day. But now, that same skill set felt like a curse. Newman Enterprises was crossing a line so sharp that Michael could practically feel it cutting through his own moral skin. Victor's campaign against Jabot was not the typical corporate chess match. It was a calculated strike fueled by something stolen, something that never belonged to him in the first place. The deeper Michael looked, the more he sensed the rot underneath the polished surface, power that fed on entitlement, strategy that treated wrongdoing as genius, ambition that demanded obedience even from the people who still believed in right and wrong. Michael kept hearing two voices in his head, both cruel in their own way and warning him that Victor's wrath could destroy everything he had. The other asking him what was left of him if he continued to justify the unjustifiable. Lauren saw the change before Michael admitted it even to himself. She didn't need a confession. She could feel the tension in him like a constant hum. He was quieter, more distant, carrying an anxiety that didn't fade after a long day at work. Lauren's worrying was not dramatic, not theatrical. It was the kind of fear that settles into someone who loves a person standing too close to a cliff edge. She urged Michael to listen to his conscience, to protect what was right, to protect the people he loved, not because she didn't understand what Victor could do, but because she understood what Michael would become if he kept shrinking from his own values. Lauren didn't offer him easy comfort. She offered him truth, that the safest path might be the one that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and that sometimes a man breaks not from what he suffers, but from what he helps others suffer. Her words didn't remove Michael's fear, but they gave it shape, turning it from a vague dread into a decision he could no longer postpone. Even with Lauren's guidance, Michael didn't rush headlong into rebellion. The very thought felt reckless. Diane's presence complicated everything, because Diane was not asking for a simple favor, she was pushing him toward the most dangerous choice of his career and his personal life. Diane's conditions and psychological manipulation were wrapped in a careful kind of logic, the sort that sounded like reason but carried an unmistakable edge of control. She pressed him with urgency, reminding him that time mattered, that every delay allowed Victor's plan to burrow deeper. She made it sound as if hesitation itself was complicity. Michael could see what she was doing, and that was part of what made it so effective. When manipulation is obvious, it doesn't always lose its power. It simply becomes another weight you carry, another compromise you make while telling yourself you're still in control. Michael resisted, not because he disagreed with the goal, but because he feared being turned into someone else's weapon in a different war. And still, despite his resistance, Michael agreed to meet Diane in secret. The choice to meet her alone was the first step into a world where nothing could be undone. The secrecy itself felt like betrayal even before any documents changed hands. Michael arrived carrying his concerns like a loaded gun he didn't want to fire. He told Diane, without needing to dress it up, that Victor's scheme against Jabot had begun to feel less like aggressive business and more like something that could damage people who didn't deserve to be crushed. That admission was a crack in the armor Michael had worn for years. Diane didn't react with surprise. She reacted like someone who had been waiting for that crack, ready to widen it. Diane revealed what she had, evidence that Victor had used a stolen AI program and deployed it against Jabot with calculated cruelty. The information landed in Michael's mind like a cold shock. It wasn't merely a rumor or a suspicion. Diane presented it as something tangible, something that could be traced, verified, and used. Michael felt his stomach tighten because the truth created a kind of inevitability. If the evidence existed, then the ethical debate inside him was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. It was actionable. It demanded a response. The most disturbing part wasn't even the theft itself, but the intent behind it. Victor had taken something illicit and used it not as an accidental advantage, but as the centerpiece of a deliberate attack. That revealed not just strategy, but mindset. Victor believed he had the right to win by any means, and he believed no one around him had the right to stop him. Michael left that meeting with his fears sharpened, not softened. He understood more clearly than ever what he was up against. Victor's power was not only financial or political, it was psychological. Victor created loyalty by making people feel that opposing him was a kind of suicide. Michael had lived under that shadow long enough to know it wasn't an exaggeration. And yet, as he sat with Diane's evidence and replayed Lauren's words, another truth began to rise in him. If he did nothing, he would become an accessory not just to Victor's tactics, but to Victor's transformation of reality into something where wrongdoing could masquerade as brilliance. Michael's conscience did not offer him peace. It offered him a demand. He decided to act. But he did it in the only way a man like Michael could, quietly, precisely, and with a lawyer's obsession for proof. He began to gather additional documents, verify sources, trace timelines, and build a chain of authentication strong enough to survive the inevitable counterattack. He understood that a half measure would be fatal. If he moved against Victor, the strike had to be decisive, because Victor would not simply defend himself, he would destroy the attacker. Every step Michael took felt like walking across thin ice, listening for cracks, knowing that the wrong move could plunge him into a freezing abyss. He lived in a constant state of alertness, careful not to appear different, careful not to let Victor read suspicion in his posture or hear it in his voice. Michael's fear became disciplined. It didn't vanish. It became a tool that kept him sharp. Then the unimaginable happened. The evidence set this explosive, catastrophic truth leak to the public. The moment it escaped the shadows, it became a scandal with its own momentum, spreading faster than anyone could control. Newman Enterprises was shaken not by a whisper, but by a roar. The story wasn't framed as a complicated corporate dispute. It was framed as a powerful empire using stolen AI to wage a ruthless attack. The public reaction didn't wait for internal explanations. Investors, observers, and enemies all smelled blood. What Victor had intended as a hidden advantage became a public liability, turning his confidence into vulnerability and forcing him into a defensive posture he despised. Victor's rage was immediate, volcanic, and deadly. He didn't simply respond to the scandal, hunted for the source. Control was Victor's oxygen, and the leak represented a kind of humiliation he could not tolerate. He moved to contain the crisis with the same ruthless efficiency he used to win wars, tightening internal access, demanding loyalty tests, isolating potential suspects, and projecting strength even as the ground beneath his empire trembled. But behind the polished public face, Victor's mind narrowed to one obsession: finding the traitor inside his own walls. For Victor, this wasn't just a business emergency. It was personal. It was a violation of his authority. It was proof that someone close to him had dared to challenge his dominance, and Victor would make an example of them. Michael felt the pressure close in from every side. Fear returned in a new form, not the abstract fear of what Victor might do someday, but the immediate fear of being discovered. Yet even in that pressure, Michael found a strange kind of steadiness. He had already crossed the internal line. He had already chosen what kind of man he wanted to be. That didn't make the consequences easier, but it made his direction clearer. He told himself that if he allowed Victor's plan to continue unchecked, the damage would spread, and the people he cared about would suffer in ways he could never justify. If he was going to fall, he would fall protecting something that still mattered: justice, decency, and the fragile idea that power should not be allowed to rewrite morality. The tension reached a breaking point as Victor's pursuit of the traitor sharpened into a direct confrontation. Michael could feel Victor's suspicion like a spotlight searching the dark, and he understood that Victor's instincts were never random. Victor had known Michael long enough to sense shifts, to smell hesitation, to recognize when loyalty had begun to fracture. Even if Victor didn't yet have proof, he had something almost as dangerous: certainty. And certainty in Victor's hands was often enough to destroy a person's life before the facts could catch up. Michael faced the storm with a grim acceptance. The betrayal, in Victor's eyes, was unforgivable. Victor didn't see Michael's choice as an act of conscience. He saw it as treachery. And Victor's vow, formed like a blade, cold and unwavering, would punish Michael for this. Not only to satisfy his anger, but to restore the order he believed the world owed him. A world where those who stood near him never forgot their place. Michael felt the weight of that vow settle over him, and for a moment, the sheer scale of Victor's power threatened to crush his resolve. But then he remembered Lauren's steady fear, Diane's brutal evidence, and his own exhaustion with being the man who cleaned up moral disasters for someone else. He did not feel heroic. He felt terrified. Yet he stayed firm, because the alternative was a life built on the lie that loyalty mattered more than truth. In the aftermath, nothing felt safe or simple. Newman Enterprises reeled, Victor fought to regain control, and the hunt for the internal betrayer intensified like a tightening noose. Michael stood in the center of that tightening, carrying the burden of what he had chosen and what it would cost. He had protected justice, but justice did not protect him. It did not guarantee that he would be spared. It did not promise that his relationships would survive or that his future would remain intact. It only offered him one brutal consolation: that he was no longer the man who looked away. And as Victor's anger surged toward him with the promise of punishment, Michael understood that the true battle had only just begun, it in boardrooms or headlines. But inside the space where fear and conscience collided, where a man must decide whether he can live with what he's done or live with what he refused to do,